The night that I won the Oscar for it, there was one amazing thing, which was that my family were abroad. They were all on holiday. They were all watching. It was a different time zone. And my older brother, James, had done this thing where he had put his phone at the back of my family watching the television when it happened. And he had pressed record just in case. The most extraordinary thing about winning an Oscar was watching my family's reaction, which was amazing. Hi, I'm Eddie Redmayne, and this is the timeline of my career.
Well, not even the postcard I sent to wish you luck for your exams. Perhaps that got lost.
Well, we got a card from Aunt Joan in Malta the other week, so there's nothing wrong with the post. But Dad's still complaining about the amount of junk mail we get. It goes straight in the bin. Doctors
is a soap opera in Britain, and in each episode a doctor deals with someone having a crisis. And I got cast in this thing, and I've been doing theatre for a while, but I'd never got close to getting any TV or film auditions because I hadn't trained and I had no idea what I was doing. So whenever I went to auditions, without me knowing, I was like projecting to the back of the stalls without realising that, cameras see everything. And I hope that you don't have any footage of it, because if anyone sees that, that's the end.
She was so brilliant, and you crushed her. It's like you're trying to crush me now.
I remember being introduced to the crew. I'd never seen a camera crew. They were in the garden of this house. I met the actor that was playing my dad, who was about to have a heart attack. They were all already set up, and they said, can we just sort of shoot the rehearsal? They told me it was rehearsal. They shot it anyway, and we only did one take. It was terrifying.
I hope you haven't incurred any kind of obligation.
Mother, we're talking about an introduction to a tailor, a clothier.
Well, very much like this material. This fabric.
It was this extraordinary true story, and Julianne Moore was in it, and an amazing man called Tom Kalin was directing it. And I remember fighting for this part, and I got the part, and then the financing fell through. They had moved on. I remember a French financier had decided that they didn't want to cast me. They didn't want to meet me again, but I flew myself to New York, pouring with rain, down in the downtown Manhattan, and arriving drenched into this audition room. And it was to test now with Julianne Moore. I'd sort of fought my way back into the room, and I walked in, and Julianne Moore looked at me and she said, oh my God, you've got freckles, you've got reddish hair, you even look like my son. And I've never been more grateful for something. And Julie really fought for me for that film.
Is it Thursday?
Yes, it is.
I have dinner with Ethel tonight. Ethel de Croisset.
I'll make other plans.
I'm sure she wouldn't mind if you tagged along.
No, I wouldn't want to impose.
I don't like what happens when you make other plans.
Mommy, please.
It's what I describe as a Marmite film. In England, we have the spread Marmite, which you either love or hate, and that's the advertising slogan. And some people are very passionate about Savage Grace, but it wasn't, and some people find it very uncomfortable. Not many people saw it. And when I was lucky enough to win the Oscar for Theory of Everything, it was the same night that Julianne Moore won her Oscar. I hadn't seen her in an age. And she said, maybe some people will watch our little movie now. I'm not sure that has happened, but it's, it was a very special moment, that film.
I didn't know it was so pretty out here.
You should get out more. You should see the sights.
Well, I am the sights. We're just like Elsie and the Young King.
I didn't know a huge amount about Marilyn Monroe other than the obvious, and I couldn't quite believe this story of Colin Clark, this young first AD, having this moment with this screen icon was true. It was being produced by Harvey Weinstein, and that was complicated because I got cast in it by the lovely Simon Curtis, and then I remember on our first day of filming, and I remember he told me on day one to walk with him. He said, walk with me. And I was terrified. And he sort of told me that basically he didn't want me in the movie and that I was moving my face too much. So my sort of overwhelming memory of that film is just trying not to move my face, which explains quite a lot of the performance.
I have something in my eye.
I can't see anything.
That's the first time I've kissed anyone younger than me. There's a lot of older guys in Hollywood.
We went to this lake to shoot it, and it was meant to be this romantic scene of these two people swimming, they have a kiss, and the reality was, they called action. Michelle and I waded into this sort of sub-zero, well, can't be sub-zero, otherwise it would have been frozen, but very, very cold water, and any acting went out the window. Was just trying desperately not to freeze to death. It's a beautiful book by Sebastian Faulks, and since I'd started acting, there had been various film versions of Birdsong. It had been impossible somehow to get made, and I think that's because of the complexity of the story. And Abby Morgan sort of cracked the story by playing it through flashback. I didn't know anything about these sappers, these miners in the First World War who would go right under no man's land. So they would dig silently under no man's land and put bombs and explosives.
It's the right way. It's where the second explosion went off. Blocked the way out. I will not die in a fucking tunnel!
I was lucky enough in the prep to it to go to this newly found mine in France, and basically you went down this chalk mine that hadn't been seen or opened since the First World War. And I went down with this miner with a torch, and it was all chalk, so this extraordinary sort of igloo-like feeling of the light reflecting. The miner then pointed to this bit of writing in pencil that had been written by a soldier during the First World War in this kind of dug space underneath no man's land. So imagining that, all that chaos and carnage going above. And he had written in pencil this poem that went, "If in this place you are detained, don't look around you all in vain. Cast your net and you shall find that every cloud is silver-lined. Still." And this was written in pencil. This idea that this man might be buried there, and that no one had seen this pencil writing it was an instant connection to something that was dumbfoundingly humbling.
A ghost, you say? A ghost, maybe. She was just like a ghost to me. 1 minute there, then she was gone.
People that like Les Mis, they don't like Les Mis. They love that musical. And I think when Tom Hooper started auditioning people for that film, like half of Hollywood came sort of running out of the musical theatre closet to express their undying love for that piece. I'd worked with Tom before on a television series about Elizabeth with Helen Mirren, and I knew him. And I was in North Carolina playing a Texan meth addict with a limp in a film with Chloe Moretz, and I heard that they were doing it. I just felt a bit embarrassed that this person I knew was directing it, and I knew that I wasn't probably the obvious fit for Marius, and it's quite a strain to sing that part, but my inner 9-year-old was desperate to be a part of this. So in my Winnebago in the middle of North Carolina, I filmed myself sort of dressed as a cowboy singing Empty Chairs and Empty Tables, and sent it off into the ether.
Oh, my friends, forgive me. That I live and you are gone. There's a grief that can't be spoken. There's a pain goes on and on.
Singing live in the moment. None of us had done that before, and very few people had done that on film before. So it was this great leveler. It meant that everyone had their own levels of anxiety, which we were playing with together. But finding sort of spontaneous thought in song and singing with that intimacy was wonderful. I also got to meet a woman called Jen White, and she played the keyboard. So she would sit there playing this keyboard silently into our ears. So she would have monitors in front and watching our performances and reacting to what we were doing. She was the unsung hero of that piece because her sensitivity allowed the performance to have that sensitivity. And just this year, I finished doing Cabaret, a production of Cabaret in London, and Jen was our musical director. So it was a wonderful full circle moment for me.
So, if you reverse time, then the universe is getting smaller.
All right.
So, what if I reverse the process all the way back to see what happened at the beginning of time itself?
They had offered it to lots of other actors, and fortunately those other actors turned it down. And I met with James Marsh, who made one of my favourite films ever, which is A Man on Wire, and we met in a pub in Marylebone and got on incredibly well. I remember I was auditioning at the time. There was another film that I was sort of in the running for, and I think it became one of those moments that happens occasionally when you're not necessarily being offered either part, but the other film hears about the other part, and so they sort of feel like they have to jump and ask you to do it. I'm very grateful for that other film. But I got cast in Theory of Everything, and it was one of those moments of overwhelming elation that about 3.5 seconds later turned to excruciating fear. Stephen Hawking was an amazing man. His family are extraordinary people, and we knew that he was going to watch the movie. It made me kind of grip a situation in a way I hadn't before. I was like, I hadn't been to drama school. I didn't know what process was. I was busy working out process by observing other actors. And on this one, I said, okay, I need time, and this is how I want to approach it. And I was able to go to motor neuron disease clinics and meet people living with this disease and their families. I was able to work with a dancer who I now work with and have done for years, a woman called Alexandra Reynolds, who helped me with the physicality. Understanding that as an actor, like some actors can jump from part to part and be extraordinary in all of them, I'm someone that needs like a long runway. And that's what Theory of Everything was, where I worked that out.
Dr. Stephen Hawking.
Dr. Stephen Hawking.
Thank you.
Very nice. It is astonishing he's the first person to receive his doctorate, bearing in mind how little work he's been doing. Work was the worst four-letter word for Stephen.
I remember that the day that I was cast in Theory of Everything, there was an article on Deadline that said, this is the sort of part that wins prizes. And I remember thinking, really? Really? You're going to start there? Like, so basically, unless I win an Oscar, I've kind of like failed. The night itself was so adrenaline fueled that I really can't remember much. It was too much to take in, honestly. It was overwhelming. Straight after you win, you're taken off stage. It was Cate Blanchett who had given it to me, who is one of my favourite actors and someone I'd worked with years before. And suddenly you're spun into this sort of mosh pit of press asking you questions about Neighbours, which was a soap opera Australian soap opera I'd loved when I was like, what? Wait, this just happened and now I'm talking about my childhood sort of love of Neighbours. And then straight onto parties, but you don't actually have a moment to sit with that. I love Newt. I loved him as a character from the second I read him. He was eccentric, he was unique, he had extraordinary empathy, and he was passionate. Passion is an interesting thing. It's a thing that's not often celebrated. It's quite often uncool to care. When we started on the first Fantastic Beasts, there were things that were very stressful, like having a wand is like your childhood dream, but suddenly you're presented with this thing and you get complete stage fright and don't have a clue what to do with it. And so one school was created, an apparating school, like this feeling like when you have to sort of disappear into the mist. But then it was always interesting. You became very blasé about that stuff and about the kind of everydayness of having a wand. But then the joy of those films was getting to watch new actors come in and be presented with their wand and watching the inner kid just like reveal itself from everyone and anyone, however extraordinary the actor. You were also allowed a lot of freedom. I remember there being one day when my character was down in his case and there was a creature that the Thunderbird, Frank the Thunderbird, that when he gets sort of stressed, rain pours from him and I was meant to get drenched. I remember saying to David Yates, the director, that if I'm drenched, that's fine, but I'm then going to be drenched for the rest of the movie. And he was like, oh yeah, that's the thing. And then it was early on and I didn't know how much you were allowed input as an actor. And I was like, there's no chance that I could just change my wand into sort of an invisible umbrella, is there? He's like, yeah, great, do it. You could see the sort of vis effects people be like, oh, okay. And throughout that experience. Like David, our director, allowed your input. One of the extraordinary things about the Fantastic Beasts films was also the international cast that they get. So our films were set, one was set in Paris, New York, one was set in Berlin, and you get some of the greatest, German actors or French actors coming in to do one day.
I imagine that you're all wondering why you find yourselves here. And in anticipation of that, Dumbledore asked that I convey a message. So Grindelwald has the ability to see snatches of the future.
And I loved the trio of actors that I was cast with. Alison Sudol, Dan Fogler, and the wonderful Catherine Waterston. It was an amazing thing to get to work with these guys, and on a scale that was unlike anything I'd ever seen. My sort of main takeaway from those movies was just this wonderful group of actors and crew who invention was just spilling out of them.
I don't want to talk about Parkfield.
Why not?
This was a script that I read by Christy Wilson Cairns, a story that I knew nothing about, and I did not understand how I didn't know anything about nor the name of perhaps the most prolific serial killer in history. The script revealed itself as something much more complex than that. It was actually a hero's journey. It was the story of this woman, Amy Lochran, who was able to stop this man, who she was great friends with, to prevent him from doing these things when the systems had failed. We're so used to horrific things or violence being prevented and stopped by violence. And actually what this film was about was how violence was ended through compassion. I found that interesting, coupled with the fact that it was Jessica Chastain, who I think is one of the great living actors, and Tobias Lindholm, who I think is one of the great living filmmakers. He wrote Another Round, and I was desperate to be in a Tobias Lindholm movie. And from the opening shot of this film, it's his vision on the world. Well, Jess and I first met in a swimming pool. Very odd, in Italy. There's a children's film festival called the Giffoni Film Festival. We met then, and for years we would see each other, but in this very weird, slightly, incredibly strange Hollywood way that you would meet on James Corden's sofa at a talk show, or you would meet dressed in glad rags on a red carpet at the Oscars. And so it's it was a friendship, but it was probably quite a cosmetic friendship. But I loved her, and I massively admired her work, and I loved this person that was effervescent and optimistic. And so when we got to work together, we have similar processes. We both love the rigor of prep and research and all the stuff that kind of gives, but then also throwing all of that away and just sparring off each other. Jess and I were sent to nurse school, which was extraordinary and intense, and I learnt lots of things, and principally that I'm a useless nurse. Also, dialect. Charlie Cullen had a really specific voice, and there was recordings of that, so I worked with Michael Buster, wonderful dialect coach, and then I worked on the physicality with Alexandra Reynolds, who I first worked with on Theory of Everything, and he has a really specific posture. He was described as looking like a question mark. And so that was something I tried to do months in advance, so that by the time we were on set, you put all that, bury that somewhere deep inside you. And then Jess puts it beautifully, actually. You it's all about hiding rather than showing. And particularly with this man who was, who was almost invisible. The thing that I dreamt of as a kid is getting to be kind of a member of a circus, really, like a nomad that travels the world and gets insight into people and stories that I would never have stumbled across. I love the different worlds and moments in history that I've got to stumble and swim in.